Thank you, everyone. Thanks very much for joining, I think, which is a very important panel, both for iWage, as we are a gender research and advocacy center, and for the gender and inclusion team at the bank. This is a part of the 16 days of activism that is being led around the world against gender-based violence. And I think we have a very exciting panel today, which is brings a lot of experience in the field, not just on, how women experience violence, women and children, but also what are the solutions that can be brought on board, which is how we've designed this panel, and what has particularly happened after the pandemic, where there's been a lot of talk about a shadow pandemic and how women and girls have started experiencing more violence, particularly during the lockdown, as they were in close proximity with their perpetrators. I think from some of the panelists, you'll also hear that the word shadow is perhaps not the right word. Women were already experiencing violence even earlier as well, but it's become a much more visible issue now. So I'll stop there. And before we go further, I'll ask Mr. Hideki Mori, who's the operations manager for the World Bank India office, and who's chairing this session, to give his remarks. Mr. Mori, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Samia. And then the good morning, good day, and good evening, everybody, depending on where you are. And on behalf of the World Bank and the India Gender and Inclusion Platform, I welcome you to this Lighthouse event on a call to ending gender-based violence. What does it take to mark our solidarity with the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence? Gender-based violence is one of the starkest forms of gender discriminations, as you all know. Its eradication is even more crucial than ever during this COVID-19 pandemic. Several studies started showing that about 50% of women have suffered some form of violence in public spaces, and about 35% of women worldwide have experienced physical violence perpetrated by the intimate partner. The World Bank's group's gender strategy emphasizes on the full and equal participation of women and men, girls and boys in societies and communities. To meet this objective effectively, addressing gender-based violence and building preventive measures to reduce instances of violence against women, adolescent girls is a corporate mandate of the World Bank operations. In India, we are committed to identifying and addressing the risk of gender-based violence through bank-financed operations in all sectors, including infrastructure, social development, and human development sectors. According to the increasing volume of data and reports, violence against women and girls, particularly domestic violence, has intensified during the current COVID-19 pandemic. And this number will likely to increase. The official data of National Commission for Women shows that domestic violence complaints in the country have increased by 2.5 times since the nationwide lockdown began. The situation is quite grave and is mirroring the deep-rooted nature of gender-based violence and getting intensified. The World Bank is committed to increasing the gender impact of our programs, and our project teams are working closely with central and state ministries and also non-governmental partners to build innovative solutions on violence and prevention. It's been World Bank priority to guide our own staff and to support clients and partners to ensure gender-informed analysis, the project preparation and realignment of existing operations to address gender-specific concerns originating from the pandemic. This has included the advice on how to address gender-based violence and dissemination of a database on relevant service providers to our country offices in South Asia region, and clients who can inform the communities about what these services are and how to access them. Building Back Better must be inclusive and must include women, girls, and other vulnerable groups. Therefore, today's conversation is very important for us. And I am very pleased that we can do this in partnership with Lighthouse's consultative groups on women economic empowerment. The group brings together representatives from over 20 organizations across multilateral, bilateral, civil society, academic and research organizations, as well as private sector. I'm sorry, I'm not going to name all of them because it's going to make my speech about 3 hours. However, we hope to learn ideas to address gender-based violence from our partner in the consultative group. We must also ensure that women and girls are the key agents of change. The experience from the previous pandemic and other disasters has shown that women are among the worst affected. But women are also and will be again the champions of resilience. I personally know one such woman. It's my mother. She was born in 1928, and then she survived the carpet bombing of the Allied forces all over Japan. Then, after the war, when it was very, very rare for a young woman to become a medical doctor, and through probably fighting through all the prejudice against her and other female doctors, she made it. And she made a lot of difference. Today, she's 92. And when I see her smiles, I get reminded that how resilient she has been throughout her life. She has taught me that things can change for the better, and then you have to be part of it. So therefore, I think what she has taught me, I would like to take it to my heart. And in addition, I also think about my daughter. I have 6 years old. And when I think of her, I would like the world to be a better place, particularly free of gender-based violence. So therefore, I am very interested, highly interested in today's conversation, and wish you all the best to be actively exchanging good ideas. Thank you very much, and over to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mori. And the image that you painted was very evocative and was very inspiring to start the session. I'll just request Binny to play a video, which again, we found very inspiring, and we thought we should share it with the audience before we start the panel. Binny, over to you.
Thank you, Soumya. I'll just try and share my screen now. Over to you, Soumya.
Thanks so much, Penny. So this example was just to showcase that even young women may have the resilience to actually, bear incidents like eve teasing, which is literally now a very looked down upon word. It's also been under now the molestation is actually covered under sexual harassment and certain forms of, under the legal this thing rubric. But at the same time, millions of women and particularly young girls face this sort of harassment every day in the streets of India. So we are hoping, we have a great panel with us. We are hoping to hear from them what happened after the lockdown and what are the kinds of solutions which may be brought forth to empower these women so they can report such incidents and also be empowered to face this much more confidently. Our first panelist is Ms. Sunita Dhar. She has over 4 decades of work on advancing women's human rights and gender issues. She works across women's groups, community collectives, national and international agencies, and her work has centered around participatory research studies, designing multi-stakeholder programs, and also leading best practices on ending violence against women. She's associated with Jagori, as a senior advisor. She's a co-founder and chair of the South Asia Women's Foundation, a women's fund, and she's also served on several expert committees, including on the National Commission for Women's Committee and the Supreme Court Committee on Widows Rehabilitation. Welcome, Sunita, to the panel. Our next panelist is Sonali Vyas. She's a senior program manager at Safety Pin, which is a tech platform and which designs a set of apps to collect data on women's safety in cities. As a trained architect and urban planner, she's involved in data analysis, representation, and formulation of recommendations for creating safe public places. And she firmly believes that working hand in hand with the government and non-government stakeholders can bring a positive change in the social environment of a city. We also have with us Aparna Mittal. Aparna is a leading equality, diversity, and inclusion advisor and a corporate lawyer with over 16 years of experience. She's the founder of Samna Center for Gender Policy and Law, India's leading consultancy, which is focused on equality and inclusion for all. She has a specialization on LGT and LGBTQ inclusion and brings a unique perspective on multi-themed advisory work on workplace diversity, equity, inclusion, and gender mainstreaming in organizations. Prior to setting up Samna, she was also a partner and worked on corporate law, M&A, private equity, and joint ventures with some of India's leading corporate law firms. Welcome, Aparna. Excited to have you on the panel. From the bank, we have Sanjeev Mahalkar, who's a senior transport specialist with the World Bank India office. He has an overall experience of 30 years in the transportation sector and is associated with one of the largest greenfield railway project currently under implementation in India, the Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor between Ludhiana and Mughalsarai. And in addition, he has worked on several roads and highway projects and urban mass transportation systems in various capacities. Welcome, Sanjeev. And finally, we have with us Kumar Vivek, who also works with the World Bank, and he is with the Education Global Practice. He is an Education Technology Fellow for the South Asia region and works on lending analytical thinking around school education, teacher education, and skill development. Kumar's current research projects focus on the use of ICT in governance of education system. And prior to joining the World Bank, Kumar worked with the Prime Minister's Advisory Office and with a management consulting firm in the US and Mexico. Kumar, welcome to the panel. So if it's okay with everyone, I'll just start the first question directed to Sunita. Are you online? And if you can just switch on your video.
It's on, Soumya.
Okay. Okay, so we know that Jagori Sunita has undertaken some rapid surveys after the lockdown that was imposed after COVID to look at how the redress system has been functioning across 7 states. There have been rising reports of domestic violence which are coming across, and there's this famous figure on how the NCW, the calls to the NCW helpline have really doubled and, 4 times more than what it was. But at the same time, how has the redress system function? What are you finding? How are the helplines, support services, one-stop crisis centers responding? And do you think women are facing any challenges in reaching out to these government-introduced support structures and systems? And if they are facing challenges, who are they turning to in that case?
Thank you, Soumya, Mr. Mori, and my panelists. I'm very glad that you showed this film because you focused on the agency of young women and women and not just depicting them as victims. I'm also glad that you referred to domestic violence and violence against women not being a shadow pandemic, because for many of us who've been working on it and for women's movements the world over, it's an original pandemic, right? And which never got the kind of response that other pandemics have got and are getting. So I think I'm very glad that it has now become a global issue, being taken up by all agencies, and I really hope they do their bit, just like the commitment I have just heard from Mr. Mori. You know, Soumya, many women's groups have done studies, surveys. Jaguri too has done a number of studies. We also run service centers. So at our Delhi call helpline, which functioned online, in that short period from 18th March to 29th June, we got 478 complaints of domestic violence. Originally, the complaints didn't really come, so we were wondering what was happening. Even in a study that we did with Pradhan and IWAGE being a partner in Jharkhand, women didn't really speak about, experiencing any form of violence. I think people were quite stunned by all that was happening around them and the burden of care work, and etc. So we are seeing, even in the NCW data, if we really look at the data, which has been mentioned that it is 2.5 times more than earlier, amongst the 22 categories of crimes against women, more than 47% was domestic violence. Now, we have a law in India, women's groups have worked on it. It's one of the most progressive laws in the world, and it affords right of residency to survivors of violence. They don't have to go seeking for a shelter. They don't have to go out of the home. The perpetrator is taken out. But we know all the constraints to the enactment of that law, both in terms of resources, adequate infrastructure, protection officers, and the kind. Now, in one of the studies that a group of 7 women's groups did, led by Jaguri, under the LCN network in 7 states, Delhi, Nagaland, Assam, Meghalaya, Jharkhand, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu, what did we come across? We came across the fact that most violence was experienced by the husbands and in-laws, so the marital family, and also the natal family. So let's not only put it down to spousal violence. There was experience of violence from relatives, parents, uncles, other relatives, siblings, etc., that also were recorded. We don't really have the data in depth, so I can't speak more to it. And it's not just violence by women, trans people, sex workers, home-based workers, informal sector workers, LGBTQI communities, women with disabilities. So there's been a range and different forms of violence. Largely, our data talked about physical, emotional, psychological, economic, and sexual violence. Economic violence this time has figured out, and we know the reasons why, because people lost their lives lost their livelihoods. Some have also lost their lives. Survivors' access to technology, helplines, could only be accessed via phones, and we know that we have a digital divide. Very few women, especially from lower income communities, working communities, rural areas, have access to telephones of their own, cell phones of their own. And even to those that have access, I must say, they do not record in their consciousness the helpline numbers. If we ever do a survey of women and men and organizations about which helpline to call, very few would really have the right answer. So there was a lot of advertising by women's groups, Jaguri, and many of the other groups, to advertising the helpline numbers, to creating new WhatsApp groups. The NCW created new WhatsApp groups. Everybody else did that as well. So, one had to advertise that. I wish the state had put in more resources for using the community radios, the mainstream media, etc. I wish a lot more of that was done. But however, We also know that there was confusion amongst the service providers. That's what our data showed. How do they respond? What are the special SOPs? What about the COVID testing? How will the infection spread? In the initial days, there was a lot of confusion. Can they really admit women into the shelters? They didn't have the infrastructure. The shelters are absolutely crowded spaces. I have done a study of shelters in the past, and I know there are 10 in a room with one, shared toilet and bath space and children in the same room. So we know that not enough investment has gone into services and an ecosystem of services for women and girls. And so there was this confusion. Further, we also found that the police helplines were responding, but not sufficiently enough because they were doing a dual duty. They were also put on to the pandemic patrolling duty and other security operations. We also saw that there were fewer staff. Even staff was not able to really go out to the field. They did not have access to PPE kits. The frontline workers in the rural areas also, were at risk to their lives. So there was a lot of limitation in terms of access to services. However, I think after the initial set of barriers, they were able to cope with it. There was a better outreach, both by the government as well as NGOs. Delhi had services in which the legal aid authorities reached out to pharmacies, they reached out to the mother dairy to advertise for legal support. They had camps. So there's been a lot of support that has come in, but I must say it has not been a very planned support. It's been ad hoc. And access to medical care, access to testing, access to emergency assistance and all were affected pretty badly.
Sunita ji, can I just come in to pause just so that, because we don't have enough time to go over 2 rounds. So could you just conclude quickly and then I'll pass on to the other panelists.
So let me talk about the fact that the ASHA workers, the frontline workers in rural communities played a very important role. We also saw some good responses from Tamil Nadu that converted some of its shelters, day shelters to residential. We saw Assam evolving pandemic-related SOPs. We saw Meghalaya doing information dissemination. Jharkhand converted its anti-trafficking helpline. Nagaland opened its one-stop centers, etc. In Delhi, there was a PIL, after which the government took some special efforts. Jammu and Kashmir High Court took some cases, cognizance and suo motu cognizance of cases and gave interim directions. So we saw the response of governments, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, at the panchayat level, the Pune Zilla Parishad quarantined abusive husbands, etc. In concluding this, I would like to say is that to build back better, or to build moving forward, we really need to consider violence against women, particularly domestic violence and other forms of violence against the most marginalized women, as a very critical issue in development and integrated across all our programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll just move on to Sonali after this. So Sonali, for those of you who do not know Safety Pin, it's a tech platform and a set of apps that collects data and provides solutions about safety and inclusion in public spaces based on crowdsourcing on particular streets or areas which are considered unsafe in the urban context. And the goal is to build cities where everyone can move without fear, not just women. So Sonali, everybody's talking about during the pandemic. What do you think comes after the pandemic in terms of planning cities once this period of social distancing is over and now we're seeing as different phases of unlockdown come in India and women are again beginning to navigate public spaces?
Thank you, Soumya. So to answer this question, I would say that, COVID-19 pandemic, we have been forced to rethink the way we live our lives, every aspect of our life. And by having that, it also gives us a chance to rethink the way we plan our cities. We have a great opportunity to reset and to create safer, more accessible, and gender inclusive cities. In doing so, we have to move from reactive approach to pre-preparedness, proactive approach. And I have listed some 5 areas where I think we should be moving towards. And the first one is our public spaces, the civic infrastructure. With this pandemic, we can see a lot of people have found the pleasure of walking again. So then we need to provide the infrastructure, the pedestrian infrastructure needs to be provided for all. It needs to be accessible. We have to think about uniform design guidelines while planning our footpaths. We have to also make sure that it is accessible and used by all. And in the second area where we should work is housing for all. This pandemic revealed huge inequalities in our cities. We saw the living conditions of the migrants, and this brings to a point that our shared spaces, the public toilets within these neighborhoods, they need to be rethought, they need to be replanned. And additionally, open spaces, green spaces, and the social infrastructure within the neighborhood, they are also very important infrastructure that needs to be uh, think from point of all, because people bring our cities to life, and we need to ensure that women, all the vulnerable groups, they have avenues to access them and safely access them. When we talk about women or other vulnerable groups, I feel that we also think about providing supporting infrastructure for women like women like domestic workers, be it street vendors. What are we doing about that? Are we creating our public spaces safe enough for them to move about? So for that also we need to think. And the fourth and important area where to work is public transport. Though buses and metro will take some time in getting the pre-COVID numbers, the ridership numbers, but we have seen many people using cycles. So that gives us a chance to create cycling infrastructure, and not just creating infrastructure, making sure that especially women, they know how to use it. They find it easy ways to get the cycles and use around. Like recently, NDMC, Kohima, and couple of other Indian cities have started making making bicycle pop-up lanes, so which is a good way where we are moving towards. And last but not the least, big data for planning. We we are already collecting a lot of data in terms of from individual users. We need to use this data for our planning purpose also. SafeTiffin has been collecting data on our cities in terms of safety, like how people feel in this space, and what are their concerns, right? And now traditionally the approach was top-down approach, and we feel that we should be going local, involve people, involve communities while designing their neighborhoods, while we are replanning their neighborhoods, because people want to go out, but have we made our public spaces safe and accessible for them? So that's why I think that we need to get them in the planning process, and only then we will be able to build equal, resilient, and inclusive society. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sonali. I'll just turn to Aparna with this. Aparna, you heard Sunita ji talking about this progressive legislation on the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. And actually, it's quite progressive in the sense it's expanded the definition of violence to even include emotional and psychological violence. But at the same time, despite this, there's not been much, leeway and scope for actually improving the implementation on the ground. And what do you think comes in the way? Where do you think there are gaps?
Right. Thank you, Soumya, and very nice to meet everyone on this panel today. I think a couple of broad pillars, if I may say so. One is, of course, and this is not just about domestic violence, but any form of gender-based violence. And as Sunita very rightly said, also keeping in mind issues of intersectionality, how things become even worse for marginalized communities or sexual minorities. So I think a couple of things that come in the way, definitely. One is still fairly large gap in awareness, and that is twofold. Now, we still meet women who don't know that it is not okay, that domestic violence is not okay. So they may not understand their rights. They may not understand that what is happening is not okay and they need to speak about it. And also they don't know where to reach out. So as Sunita rightly said, there is a lot of focus on putting out the numbers and helplines, but has it trickled down to every household? I don't think that's there. And I think just to add to that, we also have a lot of gap of awareness for others. So if I know there is some violence happening around me in the society I live, I could be a man, I could be a woman, but I want to help. There is a lot of apprehension that people have. How do they step into somebody's private domain and help out? So I think awareness really can be twofold, which is missing in large ways, both for the victim and for other allies. And if really the way we see ads prior to any tax collection deadline, that you have entire newspaper blowouts and advertisements on tax collection, if that kind of focus can be brought into violence against women across the various facets of violence against women, and also put out that outreach of helpline numbers, support groups, etc., I think that will be a great way to bridge that gap. Second, of course, in terms of gaps, because you've specifically asked me, is the law is a progressive law. Not many other jurisdictions have thought through the kind of detailing that we have in this law. But having said that, I still find a lot of gaps in the implementation, and that again is multifold. Whether you're talking about the sensitization of the cops or of the police that you're talking to, or you're talking about how quickly are they responding. Does the state machinery have quick response teams available to look at all facets of domestic violence, whether it is the emotional aspect, it is mental health, it is medical aspect, or just the basic safety and security to ensure that that is provided. How do we prioritize that in terms of what the police force is doing? And lastly, I think, which is, because I do work mostly with corporates, and one of the reasons I set up Samana is that while I was advising leading corporates in India, I never found any discussion on issues of gender. So I really think that, COVID has blurred the distinction between houses and workplaces. Now, every workplace has gone into somebody's house now. And it is high time that employers open their eyes to facts around them, and they can't any longer hide behind the divide between workplace and home. And how can really, if the internal ERGs or the internal support groups, or just the fact that each large employer can reach out to 2,000, 3,000 women, even a lot more numbers of the workforce, if those conversations are still missing, I'm yet to find more than maybe 10, 15 corporates still not talking about these issues. And I think that really is a big gap that we should look to fulfill in some way.
Thanks so much, Aparna. This is very insightful. I'll just shift to Sanjeev now. Sanjeev, you have tremendous experience, as we introduced you, in the infrastructure and transportation sector in the World Bank. How do you see gender-based violence play out in the infrastructure transportation sector in bank projects? Sanjeev, are you online? I can.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. In fact, I was on mute. Thanks, Soumya. I would start by saying that unfortunately, the transport sector and services have remained a major concern and issue for women's safety and GBV. And this is not only in India, but across the world. Women traveling in public transport, I think Sonali did mention, the earlier speakers did also mention as well, buses, metros in urban areas, even walking in public spaces. Now, all of those expose women to risk in some way or the other. This could be on account of poor enforcement, but there could also be issues of designing, proper designing. Poorly lit public spaces, for example, bus stops, stations, the entry exits to those stations, adjacent land use to schools, colleges, and several others. All of these, if not provided and maintained properly, are potential risks for women's safety. construction activities, what you referred to, Soumya, construction activities that we are, as you know, the World Bank also associated with, and specifically with regard to the infrastructure or transport projects, have a tendency to expose local communities to outsiders and therefore to GBV. Major projects with large influx of workers has a potential to increase such risk. In addition, cases of land acquisition and resettlement for major infrastructure projects. Now here as well, women are extremely vulnerable to GBV. And more specifically, when they're denied titles or joint ownership rights of the new assets and properties that are basically handed over by the governments. Of course, infrastructure building opens up opportunities for the local population, but it creates an inevitable interface with communities. In the post-COVID context, where major infrastructure boost is seen as a key to reviving the economy, the associated issues of GBV are also likely to follow course. We would also recall, a few decades back, the response to HIV/AIDS and how the bank responded to it, how the multilateral agencies and the rest of the world responded to it. In the bank's approach in the transport sector, the HIV/AIDS related issues and the prevention and mitigations were seamlessly integrated. In a similar fashion, now GBV has been recognized as a construction stage social issue for infrastructure projects that needs to be taken cognizance of, and an appropriate response mechanism through prevention and mitigation should be developed to address the same. And the bank is, of course, working and committed towards it, as Hideki mentioned as well.
Thanks so much, Sanjeev. This is very helpful. And Kumar, I just wanted to understand, just like Sanjeev has spoken about gender-based violence in the infrastructure and transportation sector, what is your experience in dealing with such issues in the education sector, particularly in schools, the violence that children experience, girls experience while accessing toilets? So over to you on thoughts on that.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Soumya, and this has been a fascinating conversation so far. In the education sector, in school, that's where most of the conversations lie, where we talk about school-related gender-based violence, SR, GBV. Now, there are other parts of the education system as well, which might be impacted with similar issues, but I think schools happen to be the largest discourse. Now, technically, some of the definitions were provided by Sunita ji around what it means of sexual, physical, or psychological violence which occurs in or even around the school. Could be in the form of bullying or verbal or sexual harassment or assaults, even corporal punishments that probably might be administered in some gendered or discriminatory ways. Not that corporal punishment should be the norm. Now, everyone in the school community, which is the students, the teachers, the management, or even the support staff, anyone can experience these kind of instances of GBV, school-related GBV, and they can experience it either as victims or as perpetrators themselves, or in some cases both. But I think the most devastating impact, and we're talking about millions of children every year, the most vulnerable group that gets impacted is that of girls. And as some of the panelists before me mentioned, I think a lot of these could be due to socially entrenched gender norms, the stereotypes. Some of it also gets reinforced by the unequal power dynamics that we see between boys and girls, as well as between teachers and students. So to the specific question on how does these gender-based violence issues play out in the education scenario, well, I think there are some obvious impacts that these instances have, and it's a long-term issue. It's an ongoing thing that education system deals with, even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. I think the first is the low attendance rates for girls, and this becomes a double whammy because the access for schooling for girls was anyway disproportionate in many parts of the world due to the social norms and stereotypes around the roles and responsibilities of girls in the families. And more often than not, the roles of girls are sort of skewed towards supporting the families or doing domestic chores, which already prevented them from accessing education. Now, on top of it, if there are instances of school-related gender-based violence, or even if there is a perception of these instances happening in the school environment, I think that leads to this double whammy of girls not showing up in schools. Because even when there are no instances or cases, reported cases of violence happening, the parents and the communities, especially in the rural areas, tend to be unwilling to send girls to schools. And this might be, I would say, exacerbated in residential schools where there could be more cases of these things happening. So low attendance rates specifically for girls is one of the things in which this plays out. And I think the second one is the low attendance itself that can then manifest itself into lower learning outcomes for eventual dropouts as well. And a lot of these problems also are location dependent, which complicates the nature of this problem. For example, in India, there was a mention of the Jagori survey in Nagaland and a couple of other states as well. I think some of these states, the hilly ones, the northeastern region, where the access of schooling was anyway an issue due to difficulties in commuting, areas such as Schedule 5 areas or left-wing extremism affected areas, all these pockets where access was issue, the school-related gender-based violence tends to become even more complex. So I think overall, instances of for terms of accessing and participating in education. But the bigger issue is the fundamental one, which is these kind of experiences tend to violate the basic right to an equitable and inclusive education that's available to everyone. So I think it's pretty challenging and complex within education. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Kumar, and thanks for laying it out so well on actually how even perceptions of violence can actually stop girls from attending schools and then put in a cycle where they're really out of the school net and then their learning outcomes also suffer. And also the point about boys, that it's not just women and gender is really about both girls and boys. So about boys also facing violence. I just wanted to, before I go on to the next round of questions with all the panelists, just wanted to request the audience, if you have any thoughts in your mind and also any queries, please keep putting them in the chat box, which I'll aggregate and then again, put it back to the panelists. But back to you, Sunita ji. As you know that we have been talking about, and you referred to it, that it's really not a shadow pandemic, and this has been a pandemic that's existing for long. Do you think that the rise in violence that we are seeing, or the reported rise, let's say, and things that were already there, is only a mirror of existing gender inequalities that have existed for long in the Indian context? And more so, do you think certain sections of women are actually more vulnerable to violence?
Yes, indeed. Of course, we have to use an intersectional, as Parna said, and an intergenerational lens to what's happening to violence against women, trans, queer people, and those from marginalized sections, including to girls, because there has been a lot of impact on young people and boys as well. We do live in a patriarchal and a regressive, societal norms context. And we know that the kinds of socioeconomic inequalities that have been experienced by those from the marginalized sections of society, there is additional violations that they experience because of structural forms of violence, discrimination, and stigmatization. Trans community, disabled women with disabilities, women sex workers do face a lot of stigmatization. And so that has got perpetuated, and they have felt extremely excluded from the benefits of any policies that was being handed out to the communities by the state and NGOs. Now, let me look at some of the critical aspects which have got affected. We know that there's been a decline in the workforce participation rate. The data that has come in this period of time has shown the loss of incomes and livelihoods of large numbers of women in the informal sector, which is where they are. They lack social protection, their work is not counted, and many other reasons. I'm not going to go into that. But we do know that economic control, your earnings when they decline, your position and status in the house and the way that you're treated also gets impacted quite badly. We also know that there's been an increased burden of unpaid care and domestic work on women and girls during this period throughout the world, definitely in India. And while there is some data to say boys and men helped out initially with some chores in the public space, the intense everyday work in the house fell on women and girls. And that also became a huge barrier for them in terms of the stress they faced, in terms of, multiplying the kind of work that they had to do, etc., taking care of the sick, running the household. And many of them were unable to even afford a mask or afford sanitizers or afford anything that could, provide some protection to them. The concern that we have, and the Hathras case has also shown it, and there are many such cases of violence in public spaces and private spaces and community settings of women from the Dalit community and Adivasi women. NCRB data talks about 87 rapes per day and 8 rapes of women from the SC community and 3 from the ST community that is reported every day. Now, Dalit women face a triple burden of gender bias, caste and social discrimination, and economic deprivation. Now, all of this only gets, further widened given the way that we have seen the system respond, we have seen the communities respond. And this multiple structures of oppression and experience that they undergo prevents their access to justice, to services, and certainly to dignity and well-being. We're also very concerned about this, the response of the system, for instance. Our conviction rates to rape are so low. The certainty of conviction is just not there. And what is the deterrence in the system? We see death penalty as a deterrence. We know that death penalty is not a deterrence to the system. We need widespread education. We need reach out. We need to transform mindsets. We need to reach out to influential gatekeepers, policymakers, political leaders, men, boys, etc. Far more work needs to be done on that front. We have also seen the fact that there's been a lot of pressure in the families on early marriage, post-marriage for girls within the families, because the economic stress is so high and communities want to move on in, they consider the girls as pariah dhan in many contexts. And so we've seen that the response to girls, also the kind of surveillance that has been carried on within the family, the mobility of girls has got affected. Where are they going? Who are they talking to? They're schooling from home, some of them, some are not. So when we look at all of this, we're looking at the fact that there's a lot more work to be done on inequalities, specifically gender, caste, class inequalities. We have far more work to be done there through education, through mindset change, through campaigns. There were a lot of films, spots, campaigns that have been done by women's groups, including Jaguri. We need disaggregated data. We need responsive helplines. We need our frontline workers to be trained as paralegal workers, because believe me, the paralegal workers in every community that were trained prior to the pandemic were the ones that did enormous amount of work, and nobody has talked about what they have done during this pandemic to, access services and facilitate services for survivors. We also need to work in conversions. We are seeing that there's a lack of conversions amongst the government's systems. NRLM is a good umbrella under which to work. The Ministry of Women works on its own. The health works on its own. We need very effective conversions, not by the women workers on the ground, which they are doing, but by the system to support these women frontline workers. And last but not the least, I think we should not forget that we live in a culture of impunity. We live in times where the culture of impunity is all around us. We just need to break the culture of impunity. We cannot only focus on domestic violence. We have to look at other forms of violence, anti-trafficking, witch branding, and everyday abuse that women and girls face. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sunita ji. That is really comprehensive and very, structured in terms of what solutions we need to take up forward, going forward. Aparna, I'll turn to you next. You made a very interesting point about the workspace no longer being the traditional workspace and actually now including in their blurred boundaries with now the workplace including the home as well. How do you think organizations should respond when it comes to actually implementing acts like the POSH Act or even the prevention of domestic violence, which is very tricky, but at least even the POSH Act, when it comes to this new definition of a workspace? Should they be issuing guidelines to employees? Also, what about the subcontractors who work with organizations? How should they be thinking about prevention of sexual harassment, at least in the domains that their subcontractors are working?
Sure. Thank you. There are a couple of questions there, and I'll try and go one by one. So I think first, if you just look at the construct of the POSH Act as the acronym, it goes by, it never defined the forum or the format in which sexual harassment could happen. So even earlier, if somebody called somebody, say a senior supervisor was traveling and he called his colleague on the phone and said something obscene or behaved in an inappropriate manner, even that would earlier be covered in the definition of workplace and sexual harassment within the POSH Act. So, the Sexual Harassment Act never really had any kind of contours to it, if I may use that word. And so even earlier, any kind of harassment through telecommunication devices, through online chats, etc., in the workplace context would be covered. And I think now what we are seeing is that has gone one step forward, because the bulk of people working from offices have started working from homes. So yes, in terms of the application of the law, I don't see any difference. But yes, of course, a lot of companies have made a second level of sensitization for their employees to ensure that they understand what really use of telecommunication devices or online platforms like this entails, and what are the additional micro steps that can be taken to address this. That's really the first part. In terms of your larger question on how do you cover subcontractors, etc. So if you look at the POSH Act, and I don't want to bore the audience with hyper technical details, but I think anyway the gateway of the Act always thought of an employer as both thought of employee as both direct employees and indirect employees. So subcontractors were anyway covered in the chain of reporting and for the purposes of the POSH Act. So if I subcontracted my work to somebody and they subcontracted to somebody else, and the person from that third company came and harassed me, it would be covered within the POSH Act. But that's not really the challenge. The challenge really is that has the information about the POSH Act trickled down to everyone? Is every company, organization, entity in the development sector in India following the POSH Act? I'm sorry to say a lot of them are not even aware about it. I really personally think, because I try and cut across this divide of corporate India and development sector. And I really think that CSR, or corporate social responsibility, has to go beyond the economic or financial terms of CSR. It is really a clarion call, if I may use that word, for companies to step forward and really work with an intention of creating ecosystem change. You can do that as simply as organizing learning sessions or training sessions for the entire service flow that comes to your workplace, contractors, subcontractors, MSMEs, absolutely third-party vendors who have no idea about what the law is, leave alone the intention to follow or comply with the law. And also, we've talked about this earlier as well. How do you use your contractual framework to really embed certain progressive conditionalities into the contracts to make sure that the vendor or the supplier that you're working with or subcontractor, they can't hide behind the fact that they just don't know. You create that avenue for them to learn, to understand, to grow and evolve, and make sure that level of preventive awareness and dispute resolution or resolution is put in place. And I personally am a really, really big believer in thought leadership. And I really think that the larger companies, whether you're on the infrastructure project side or just the pure play large companies in India, etc., you have to come forward and catalyze the conversations on domestic violence or on POSH and go beyond your immediate workplace. And clearly, because the value you bring as the lead party on a contract or as an investor agency, when you can link it to the transaction or to the finance or to whatever the primary relationship is, it will have a much larger impact on this. So really, I think I don't have too many problems with the law. I do respect the law has some gaps, but we can work around them or work through them. I really think that it's the awareness, it's the level of priority. Is it on the CEO's agenda? And can it really trickle down to everybody in our ecosystem? Those for me are bigger issues and really areas I would want our audience and everybody really to focus on, because then we can really mitigate the gap between the law and the reality that we face around us.
Thanks so much, Aparna. This is very helpful. And I think we're getting really interesting questions in our chat box as well. So as I start going to the other panelists, I will probably ask questions which have also been targeted, have been asked of them. Sonali, over to you. There's also a question that has come in, which is quite interesting, which is how does Safety Pin actually identify unsafe areas? Do you use the NCRB data or, and how do you really work with the police control rooms and the patrolling units to feed them this data that this particular area is unsafe?
So, Safety Pin, I'll give you a brief introduction about what Safety Pin is and how we collect data. So, Safety Pin is a set of apps, and we have different apps to collect data on safety. And we use a methodology called Safety Audit methodology. And in that, we basically audit a public space. Assess a public space on the range of 9 parameters. And these parameters are a mix of your physical infrastructure as well as social infrastructure. Physical infrastructure would include lighting, footpath, like the condition of footpath, accessibility to public transport, visibility, the built environment, like are there eyes in the street. Then we also look at security. I will talk in detail about the NCRB data and the police patrolling data later. But yeah, so in social infrastructure, we have people and gender usage, like how many people are using that space, and within those people, how many women and children are part of that space. And the ninth parameter that we look at it is how people feel in this space. So combining that, we have we get an average score, and that is called safety score. That is the data we have. Now this geo data, it's a geolocated data supported by images. So whenever you are doing an audit, you get to click a photograph of that public space, maybe showing the existing condition of lighting, footpath, or that just people or need just open electrical installations, whichever things people find unsafe. And once we get this data, we share it with the government so that they can improve the spaces which have been found unsafe by our data. In terms of NCRB data, we don't integrate that data with our data set. The reason being, NCRB data is not geolocated or geotagged. The data is as per the station around the country, and the data that is collected by Safety Pin is at the public space. So, for example, actually we tried doing that couple of years ago, but we found that the data was like, suppose if any crime happens, the data is recorded as per the police station, not as per the location where the crime happened. So it was very difficult to correlate with that data. But we do collect police patrolling data, and we use that to give scoring in our security parameter. I'll give you an example how in one of our cities, police were able to use Safety Pin data to improve security in certain spaces. So in Bhopal, we did a mapping of the whole city in 2017, and we gave the Bhopal police the data on security and as well as visibility. Visibility is eyes in the street principle, meaning that are there shops, are there houses around you overlooking that point? Because generally, our data says that women walking on a deserted road, they tend to feel unsafe. Roads which have high boundary walls, they don't provide any kind of visual contact between street and the built environment. So we gave the police department this data where we told them that these are the stretches, these are the road stretches where there is no visibility and no security, like currently there was no patrolling was happening there, and those were the university areas, the addas just outside the universities where the students just go for snacks and tea. And so the police actually realized that these are the hotspots, and they need to remove or they need to modify their patrolling route. So they were able to use the data in this way, and they did modify their patrolling route. So this is how we've been using the security.
Thanks, Shanali. This is extremely helpful. I'll just go over to Kumar. Kumar, some interesting questions coming up on education as well. We know that we've shifted to a digital world now in more ways than one, including for our kids, which is turning out to be a huge pressure for them as well. But one of the questions that has come up is, in terms of the solutions that we can offer to prevent gender-based violence, is reducing the distance to the school, including perhaps having digital solutions, something that is viable for girls. And secondly, can we also think of innovative transportation options, safer transportation options for girls to get them to schools? And if there are any other examples of best practices in the bank projects, education projects that you would like to refer to.
Sure. Thanks, Soumya. And these are really interesting questions. I think this problem is complicated, and it's a multi-dimensional problem. It's not just a problem of safety of commute, especially for girls, but it is also, first, it is not limited. The gender-based violence is not limited to girls in the school systems, and second, it's not just a question of safety or transportation or commuting. So I think it's a combination of two things. One is how do we provide, or how does the state provide safe spaces, safe learning environments in the school system for the kind of learning experiences that are equitable and inclusive. And the second thing is, in cases of where the instances of gender-based violence happens, what are the support systems, or what are the ways in terms of reporting mechanisms or data systems that are set up, and how different actors are coordinating to ensure that there is a resolution for these instances and there is a prohibition moving forward. So that's one part of it, trying to set up the overall school education system in a framework that allows for equitable education. And I think the second part of the equation is equally around the mindset change that is required, both at the school level for the administrators as well as the frontline delivery staff, including teachers, principals, support staff, etc., as well as the parents and communities on the other side, to really look at how these long entrenched social norms around that lead to perpetration of gender-based violence in schools can be diminished over a period of time. So I think these are two issues, and this is complicated to solve. Supply side interventions, which is suggested in terms of a solution that can around probably bringing the schools closer to girls. I think it's a question of equitable education for everybody, and there has to be this choice between, are we further segregating women through provision of specialized services, or are we trying to have an agenda that looks for mainstreaming? And that's where I think it becomes a choice at the state level to think about it. But in terms of a specific example in bank projects, I think Hideki in his opening remarks did mention our corporate mandate that requires introducing gender-specific interventions, as well as the corresponding targets across all the operations as we do. The good news is that there is recognition of the problem. So the national education policy recognizes that there needs to be safety and rights for all children, particularly girls. They have to be retained in schools, etc. So the example that I would bring about is the work with the state of Nagaland, which was also mentioned by Sunita ji earlier as part of some of the work that Jagori has done. Over there, we have helped the government with some of the knowledge and evidence to deal with school-related gender-based violence issues. And what sort of research can be translated into policies and interventions that are very specific and contextualized to the Naga societies, which is highly patriarchal, as was mentioned earlier. So I think one of the things that I mentioned as solution is investing in gathering data. How do you introduce a range of gender-sensitive indicators? At a minimum, ensuring that the education information systems are generating data which are disaggregated by gender. And the second thing is related to information systems itself is to establish the safe and confidential reporting mechanisms, which can lead to resolution of these issues. Now there needs to be protocols and procedures at various levels for dealing with the reports of any sort of these instances of gender-based violence, and more importantly, linking these mechanisms to support systems and referring to, for example, child protection systems. So what's happening in Nagaland is the government is setting up a protocol. In COVID times, of course, they set up the one-stop shop for all women, but specifically in school systems, they are setting up a protocol with an institutional state-level architecture and a response mechanism for dealing with these school-related gender-based violence incidents between staff, district-level management, and any other stakeholders such as civil society organizations who are working in the areas of violence prevention. And I think the third area to engage is teachers and communities, and Nagaland is doing a lot of work around capacity building to reshape the gender attributes towards adults and girls and boys, as well as using teachers and parents to create what should be the safe and gender responsive learning environments as envisaged in the SDG 4. So overall, I think there is very good thinking that Nagaland government has applied as part of their school education project. And there are several ideas out there as examples that can serve as examples for the rest of the India as well.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Kumar. And last but not the least, Sanjeev, there are also questions about particularly the transport sector on if there are any transport solutions, and then the ones that may have been implemented in bank projects to address gender-based violence. There's also an interesting question at large in infrastructure projects, and if you have labor camps for contractors, which have been set up by contractors, how do you prevent abuse of girls and particularly children as well in these labor camps? So over to you, Sanjeev.
So thanks again, thanks Soumya. In fact, before I go there, just wanted to inform, or rather, to mention about this very important document that the bank has, recently developed. It's called a Good Practice Note on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse and Sexual Harassment. Now, this document in specific is a guidance, particularly for the bank task team members who are implementing projects, infrastructure projects, and particularly involving civil works. Now, in addition to that, GBV is also an integral part of the environmental and social framework that the bank has basically adopted for its projects. There is a strong emphasis as a result of that on mitigation and prevention of gender-based violence. All our projects are screened for GBV risks before the associated risk factors are taken into consideration. Projects are scored. Basically, there is a screening tool that is recommended to be used by the task teams before the projects are formulated, or while the projects are formulated, the projects are screened and rated with ratings of low to moderate to high. And then based on these assessments, different solutions are basically recommended and proposed to be adopted in those projects. Also, GBV requirements and codes of conduct specifically are now a part of the bid document. So this is another tier or level of improvement, as I was mentioning in my earlier comment on HIV/AIDS. On a similar terms, the codes of conduct, the bank bid documents have basically been strengthened to account for these for GBV aspects. Minimum requirements on behavior that is not acceptable at the fields in terms of the site training requirements that are required to be imparted to the workers. Consequences of breaching the codes of conduct. These are very, very clearly outlined in the bid documents itself. So when a contractor is specifically participating, when he has his laborers or workers who are going to be coming onto the sites, they are well informed of what are the requirements on GPD that are to be taken care of. These are applicable to the staffs, to the laborers, to the subcontractors, and everybody who's basically associated with those projects. If these provisions also include, behavior which is not appropriate, and they are provisions that mentions in the code of conduct that they will be reported to the legal authorities. So there are quite strict and stringent measures. Now coming to the bank projects, in recent times, of course, these are things which I just mentioned a while ago, are things which are basically to be considered for new projects. I mean, if we are talking about the bid documents and things, but then in one of our projects, the dedicated freight corridor, as I mentioned earlier, we actually stepped in and we retrofitted these documents. I mean, these documents, the contractors came into place at a time when these GBV considerations were not clearly developed and outlined. But then we came back and we retrofitted those contracts on GBV requirements. And initially, when we started the discussion with the clients, we were quite skeptical as to how the contractor will respond, how the project authority themselves will respond. But we were quite pleasantly surprised, and that the contractors as well as the employer took them quite well. So in reality, what is happening is this, I mean, at least on this specific mega infrastructure project, which is under implementation, we have all those safeguard requirements on GBV, which have been put in place. So what did the client do? In fact, sensitization of all staffs, established, internal complaints committees, basically. Those were established with senior women staff from the organization. Confidential GRMs, the grievance redressal mechanisms were set up. Service providers were mapped. One of the most important things that is required for people, not only within the project, but also in the vicinity, to know about what are the options, what are the solutions, if they want to really contact. The helpline numbers, as we started the discussion, Sunita ji mentioned, displaying them in the project influence area. So all of those were basically taken up on the project. The contractors part, mandatory training, every day in the morning when the workers basically come onto the field, they hear the toolbox talks, and GBV is one of the most important parts of that. The awareness campaigns that are conducted by the contractors that include GBV. And again, I would like to emphasize that it is not only a part which is limited to the contractors, workers or laborers, but it spreads across the influence area of the project. So it is not only helping the project in terms of kind of preventing GBV causes, but also in the adjoining areas and vicinity. Labor camps, the things to do, the things for improvement of the labor camps. How to make segregation, what are the things that are required to basically ensure safety and protection of women laborers if they are in the camps, of the families that are of the laborers. So all of those do's and don'ts are basically recorded very clearly. So with these efforts and initiatives, at least on this huge mega project, I can very gladly, I'm very happy to inform that there have been hardly any cases that have been reported. Rather, on a positive side, certain incidents of eve teasing which were involving truckers who were basically, dumping, visiting the project sites to dump material. All of those have practically stopped after these consultations or intervention. In fact, in another bank project, a gender assessment study was conducted in the state of Uttar Pradesh. It's a road projects in the state of Uttar Pradesh, and an action plan has been prepared. And currently, we are also in our capacity as implementing the project, interacting with several of these stakeholders involving the police, involving the road agencies, the transport department, in ensuring that the recommendations of these studies are basically addressed and incorporated. So, in summary, what we have seen is it's the contractors are more than willing to do it. I mean, we somehow have a feeling that, well, it may not go positively, but the contractors are more than willing. What we have seen in the DFC project is the contractors have taken a step forward, and out of their CSR funds are doing several things in the project influence areas, including constructing toilets, the training programs for women's safety and things like that. So it's what is more important is to identify and to go to the corporates in terms of infrastructure agencies to tell them what they need to do. That's rather more important.
Thanks very much, Sanjeev. Thanks for that very comprehensive answer. I'm just going to take one more question because it applies to all the panelists. And I think that is one where if you have seen any good practice examples of networks coming in, multi-sector approaches that are being implemented across states or cities or towns where NGOs have collaborated with multilateral institutions or may have collaborated, with the private sector or even with the government to actually address gender-based violence, particularly during this time. So any of the panelists can answer and then we're running short of time. So I think we'll start wrapping up after that.
Soumya, can I come in?
Sure, Sunitaji, please.
Just very quickly, I think UNICEF, UN Women, UNFPA have worked with women's groups, with child rights groups in getting the data together, in documenting some good practices and responses, both at the local, national, and global level. The data, country-wise, has been possible. I also know that some of us are part of the Action Coalition Global Leadership Group. And so there's been a continued effort in sensitizing member states and important other agencies, multilateral, international NGOs, private sector groups. So there's been a statement. The Secretary General has made a statement on behalf of our group, which was compiled together, and efforts have been taken a lot of efforts are taking place during the 16 days of activism by various coalitions around. We are holding the Global Coalition on Safer Cities is one of those examples, and we are going to be doing a series of webinars to share multi-sector practices, to share how to work from the global to the local and local to the global. But what we need is sustained set of resources and a political will to work together. And I think sometimes that effort and time investment is not sufficiently available to the small groups at the national level. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Soumya, if I may add.
Yeah, sure. Please, Aparna.
What I've seen, at least in the private sector side, is that some companies, and unfortunately they are a rare bunch, they have taken a proactive approach in addressing both issues of gender-based violence and just the double load that came upon women on account of working from home and just being at home the whole day. So they have actually put out, and in coalition with NGOs or other support groups, 24-hour dedicated helplines, which at the cost of the company with no charge to the employees, and anybody can reach out. And while that started off as a mental health kind of intervention or just a well-being intervention, it actually pivoted into anybody trying to reach out for any kind of help on domestic violence. I've also seen organizations where some of them had apps which were installed in the phones of the workforce for late travel if they were commuting late at night, and they were integrated with the local police station, hospital, and quick response state machineries, and that were really pivoted into passing around messages around gender-based violence and making sure that that could also be used to bring this forward. And I think the third key intervention is that there has been a very strong focus, especially in the work that we do on inclusion and diversity, is to also create more allies, more vocal, proactive, conscious allies in a lot of these movements. And a lot of these conversations in corporates, at least the ones that we have interacted with, have gone beyond only talking to the women. The idea really is to talk to the entire workforce and really leverage that kind of personal commitment from each person, that they have to step up and and do their own bit in addressing these how this overwhelmingly large and overlapping concerns on gender-based violence. But there has been also industry bodies like FICCI, etc., which have with UN Women also collaborated to make sure that companies down the chain and are also educated about what kind of measures can be put in place. And the last one that I have seen is that the employee resource groups have really stepped up in a lot of companies, and they not only provide you peer support and mentoring, but you can just pick up the phone and talk to anyone and any kind of help that the person needs, whether it's on the personal front, emotional front, workplace related issues, that have really stepped up because they have a direct contact with the leadership. You can directly have a conversation and see what can be done to mitigate the circumstances that one is talking about. And really, I think ERGs are really the key to tap into a widespread kind of awareness and response system in the long run.
Thanks very much, Aparna. And just to wrap up that question, we in fact have two colleagues who have joined from the government's National Rural Livelihoods Mission. I'd especially asked them to join this call, Usha Rani and Seema Bhaskaran. And just to say that they've been doing fantastic work in the field. NRLM has set up platforms like gender forums, social action committees, which are institutional platforms set up at the local level, and where SHGs, women's SHGs can go and report such cases if they come up. And both Usha ji and Seema ji have been working tirelessly from the government side and also in collaboration with NGOs. IWAGE also has a collaboration with them, particularly to address the kind of gender-based violence that's been arising in rural areas through these institutional platforms, and also, some pilot gender resource centers that have been launched by us. But I'll stop there as we don't have time, and I'll just turn over to Kevin Tomlinson, and he's the practice manager for the Social Sustainability and Inclusion Unit for the South Asia region in the World Bank. Kevin, over to you for some closing remarks.
No, thank you very much. And I will try to be brief, and I hope my bandwidth, it was going out. So I have my video on now, but if it goes out, then I may turn it off. Listen, just let me start by I want to thank Hideki Moore, our operations manager, who gave the opening remarks today. I think he articulated the importance that the World Bank places on gender and GBV very well. Just as an aside, I've worked with Hideki. Hideki and I are both relatively new to India. I worked with Hideki last year. He was the manager, the World Bank manager for our entire program in Uzbekistan. And one of the things that Hideki did was ensured that there was a gender focus on every single piece of analytical work we did and every investment we made, including on the development policy loans, which Sunita gets at some of those systems issues. That's one of the ways that the World Bank really tries to target some of the systems issues that can impact change on the ground. And I just happened, it was a great pleasure to work with him there and to really move the needle on gender there. And I'm not even sure if he's aware, but just a couple of weeks ago, we have the World Bank approved the new development policy loan for Uzbekistan that actually has a disbursement linked indicator to gender-based violence. I don't know that we have many of those in the World Bank, but that was because of the foundations that Hideki laid. And I'm super excited to be working on this agenda with Hideki in India. So enough on Hideki. I am really excited about that. I wanted to give a special thanks to the three external panelists, Sunita, Sonila, and Aparna. Just within the last hour and a half, I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount about the gender issues in India, and again, that's just increased my level of excitement. So I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your knowledge, and I look forward to continue working together in the future. Soumya, let me thank you as well. You've done an excellent job moderating. And it was also great to hear from our education and transport colleagues, Kumar and Sanjeev. Actually, Sanjeev, people may not know this, but I think it was, it was the transport GP or the transport practice in the bank. In many ways, they have been the pioneer on a lot of the GBV work that we've done. I think it's evolved, but I have to say at the start, it was, I really believe that the transport GP were pioneers. So let me get to, the closing and try to wrap this up. Listen, I think it's going to be really difficult to capture all the excellent ideas that were discussed today. But let me give you my take on some of the most compelling ideas and work to learn from. And I think we could take forward. Sunil, on Jagora, I think, I'm not pronouncing that right, but I think Jagori. Listen, I think you demonstrated well the important role that women-led community-based organization and frontline workers play in the service delivery. I think that was, it's there, but I think it was more evident. It's been more evident during the pandemic, because the reality is a lot of these public sector agencies responsible for delivering services, their capacities were stretched. So we really got I think it really put a spotlight on the important role that these women-led community-based organization and frontline workers actually play. To me, that's reiterated the importance to ensure that these community and system level enabling factors remain a part of our dialogue. And Sunil, I absolutely, I just want to really tap on your point. It's more than just the frontline service providers. It's the entire system. So we've got to continue to focus on this in our dialogue, especially with our counterparts that we're working with on the state level. And I think what I can ascertain in my 3 months working on the India program is that's front and center in our country directors' engagement. It's front and center in our country, the World Bank's country strategy is actually focusing on these state partnerships, and institutions, and systems. So it's something that we'll continue to do. Safety pin. Sunila, it was great to hear about the role that technology is playing in promoting safer and more inclusive public spaces in cities. I think since the pandemic has hit, we've seen a bit of a respite in violence in our public spaces, but that's definitely I think there's a distancing that's been in place, and respite in violence, and I think it's something that needs front of mind when the social distancing does ease. How are we going to continue to move the needle forward on this? And I really liked, I like some of the innovative ideas and work that that Safety Pin's doing. The World Bank is thinking along the same lines, and you had mentioned, Sonila, just the importance of making sure that citizens and people are involved in planning processes, and that's front and center of what we also try to do. Third, I heard a lot about India's powerful legal mechanisms and to fight sexual harassment in the workplace and to fight domestic violence, and how it's benefited women. I think, Sunita, you had mentioned how progressive the laws were. At the same time, there's a lot of big challenges that remain. Aparna, you touched on those. I mean, I think it has a lot to do you have the laws, and then there's a lot of these challenges with implementation. But I don't know who said it, but I think a big challenge here is also mindsets, and that's going to take a while to change. So that's something that came out strong. I think it was also insightful to hear about the changing concept of workplaces in the post-COVID world, Aparna, that you had talked about, and how can we make sure that coming out of this, that we have policies that can better ensure that women and girls are protected against sexual harassment and violence in the workplace and at home, obviously. With that, I'd just like to close, and in closing, I'd like to urge this group to continue to stay connected and to continue to collaborate. I feel that we already have a lot of the strong elements to deepen GBV work. and we're actually working on a roadmap right now. And we're as we begin this process of putting together our roadmap, we want to identify concrete steps and actions. And I think having you all as a sounding board is going to be instrumental. So we may likely call on you. And on my part, I'm going to ensure, as the manager for the social team in India, I'm going to ensure that the outcomes of this meetings are discussed in follow-up meetings with the social team, and that we carry forward many of the strategies that we've discussed today. With that, I'd just like to say thank you again, and I'm very energized by the discussion this morning. With that, over to you, Soumya.
Thanks so much, Kevin. That was such a great summary and really encouraging to hear the bank's emphasis in all of these issues. And I think all of us look forward to working with you and supporting you, particularly as you move and advance on this agenda. I'm just going to now ask Harjot to close and to provide a vote of thanks. But this has been an extremely stimulating conversation for all of us, and really very micro on all the agenda items and the issues and the challenges that are cropping up, and as well as the solutions. But over to you, Harjot.